he is probably one of the most famous names in human history, right? I mean, the ultimate underdog, a man whose name just instantly conjures up this image of heroic rebellion.
Oh, absolutely.
And yet there are absolutely no writings left behind by him, like none. There are no verified portraits sketched by anyone who ever actually looked him in the eye, no monuments raised in his honor by the people who, fought beside him.
Yeah, it is a complete physical void. Everything we think we know about Spartacus is essentially this negative space, It's a silhouette that's outlined entirely by the people who are desperately trying to destroy him.
Right, and that is exactly our mission for you today in this deep dive. We are taking the source material you brought us, which is called Spartacus,
Yeah.
Gladiator, rebel, legend, and we're kind of going on a rescue operation.
A historical rescue operation, yeah.
Exactly. We're going to separate the man from the myth and really reconstruct the mechanics of how, a man armed with literal kitchen utensils nearly brought the greatest superpower on earth to its knees.
But to do that, we really have to establish a critical baseline right up front about the documents we're actually pulling from.
Right, because the sources are pretty biased, I imagine.
Oh, heavily. I mean, everything we know about Spartacus comes filtered through the pens of his mortal enemies. The surviving accounts, so we're talking writers like Plutarch, Appian, Sallust, and Florus, they were all written by Roman senators and historians.
And sometimes like decades or centuries later, right?
Exactly, sometimes centuries after the fact. So they had every ideological incentive to diminish him, to, explain away his massive victories as just, well, mere Roman carelessness rather than brilliant rebel tactics.
But wait, I have to ask, if these Roman historians hated him that much and, they literally held a pen, why didn't they just erase him from the historical record entirely? Just pretend it never happened?
Because they couldn't. I mean, they really couldn't. His rebellion was simply too devastating to Roman infrastructure and honestly to Roman pride to just sweep under the rug.
Wow, so he really did that much damage.
Oh, for over 2 years, Spartacus humiliated multiple Roman armies. So to explain to future generations why the mighty Roman war machine was getting completely dismantled in its own backyard, no less by an army of escaped slaves, these historians had to acknowledge his terrifying competence.
Right, they had to make him a worthy adversary to save face.
Exactly. In fact, Plutarch's main account of Spartacus isn't even a biography of Spartacus. He exists in the record merely as the antagonist in Plutarch's Life of Crassus.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he's just there to prove how incredibly powerful the Roman commander who finally defeated him must have been.
That is wild.
Yeah.
So Rome creates this terrifying monster, but to understand how one man could break the Roman machine, we kind of have to look at the machine itself, don't we?
We do, yeah. Because Rome was essentially designed to backfire.
Right. So what does the ecosystem of Roman slavery actually look like in the 1st century BC? Because it is not just, a few people in households. It is this massive industrial complex.
It was a pressure cooker, honestly, on a scale that is really hard for us to comprehend today. Rome's relentless conquests across the Mediterranean had flooded Italy with human captives.
Like, how many are we talking?
Hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of enslaved people over just a few generations. And this massive influx of forced labor led to the rise of what they called latifundia.
Latifundia, okay. What exactly is that?
They were these colossal agricultural estates run by wealthy elites. They essentially bought out or just violently displaced small independent farmers and replaced them with chained gang labor.
Oh, that sounds horrific.
Yeah, living in these brutal barracks-like conditions. And, I mean, that was if you were lucky. The mining camps in places like Spain were effectively slow, agonizing death sentences.
And the entire system, from what I understand, is basically held together by state-sanctioned terror?
Completely. Enslaved people had absolutely no legal personhood. Roman law relied heavily on collective punishment to maintain psychological dominance.
Oh, I've heard about this.
Yeah, there was this infamous legal principle. If one enslaved person killed their master, the entire enslaved household, men, women, and children, could be legally executed in reprisal.
That is just, it's so bleak.
It was a system designed to make the enslaved police each other out of sheer terror.
Which is exactly what makes this specific, bizarre niche of gladiatorial slavery so confusing to me.
Right. It's a huge paradox.
Yeah, because Rome relies on keeping enslaved people weak and terrified,
yeah.
Right? But then you look at the gladiator system. It is basically like a government taking its most desperate, heavily guarded maximum security prisoners, locking them all together in a single room, feeding them a specialized sports diet, and then just handing them military-grade weapons.
It is a ticking time bomb.
Yes. It makes no sense.
It is a phenomenal contradiction. Gladiators were physically formidable, they were psychologically hardened to extreme violence, and inherently bonded by shared trauma.
Right, they literally only had each other.
Exactly. Rome was mass-producing highly trained communities of lethal fighters who literally had nothing to lose. They built the bomb and lit the fuse themselves.
And that perfectly brings us to the Spark, right? Spartacus.
Mm.
Now, the sources say he was Thracian, which is from the region we now call Bulgaria, I believe.
Yeah, that's correct.
But the crucial detail here is that he wasn't actually born into captivity. He was born free.
Yes, and that psychological distinction is massive. Plutarch tells us he actually served in the Roman military at some point before becoming a prisoner and eventually being sold into the gladiatorial schools.
Wait, he was in the Roman military?
Yes. So he had the martial skills of a trained warrior, not a domestic servant. He understood Roman military tactics, their discipline, their logistics, all from the inside.
He knows exactly how the enemy thinks.
Exactly.
And there's this really bitter irony to his punishment, right? Because since he was Thracian, they likely forced him to fight in the quote-unquote Thracian gladiator style in the arena.
Right, using a small shield and a curved sword.
So they were forcing him to perform this blood-soaked caricature of his own culture just for their entertainment.
It really highlights the deep humiliation of the system. But, we also have to touch on the physical reality of these fighters, because the ancient sources, which remarkably are now backed up by modern isotopic analysis of gladiator bones, reveal this totally fascinating biological detail.
Oh yes, the diet. This blew my mind.
It's so counterintuitive.
Right, because we always picture gladiators as these incredibly lean, shredded Hollywood action stars. But they were actually fed a diet extremely heavy in barley and legumes.
Yeah, the Roman crowds mockingly called them barley men.
Barley men. And they were deliberately carb loading to build up a specific layer of subcutaneous fat over their muscles.
Right, which sounds completely backward if you're picturing a modern action movie. But functionally, it was brilliant.
How so?
That fat layer acted as biological armor. It protected their vital organs and their major blood vessels from shallow sword cuts during fights.
Wow. So they could take a hit and keep going.
Exactly. It allowed them to bleed profusely and put on this spectacular, gory show for the crowd without actually dying too quickly.
The clinical calculation behind that is just chilling.
It really is.
So you have this clinical, brutal system at the gladiatorial school in Capua, which is run by Lentulus Batiatus.
Right.
And in 73 BC, the tension finally snaps.
The bomb goes off.
But the breakout isn't some grand, sweeping, cinematic battle, is it? The original plot is betrayed, so they have to scramble. It is literally just about 70 guys fighting their way out of the barracks, using whatever they can find, like kitchen spits, cleavers, literal cooking tools.
Yeah, they burst out with no armor and cooking utensils, but they get incredibly lucky on the road fleeing Capua. They manage to intercept and hijack a shipment of proper gladiatorial weapons.
Oh, what a stroke of luck.
Completely. Suddenly, they drop the kitchen knives and have actual hardware.
And they flee to Mount Vesuvius. Which is wild because, in 73 BC, the famous Pompeii eruption is still over a century away.
Right, nobody knows it's a volcano.
Exactly. To them, it's just a steep, easily defensible mountain covered in these overgrown wild vines. So Rome hears about this disturbance, but they don't treat it like a real war.
No, not at all.
They send a praetor, which is basically a high-ranking magistrate, kind of like a regional governor doing police work. This praetor, Glaber, takes a modest militia force, blocks the only obvious path down the mountain, and figures, great, we'll just starve them out.
Glaber assumes they are just panicked criminals. He doesn't realize he is dealing with a tactician. Because Spartacus doesn't fight Glaber on Glaber's terms.
So what does he do?
The rebels take those wild vines growing all over Vesuvius and weave them into massive ropes and ladders.
Oh, wow, wait, so they literally wove ropes out of vines.
Yeah, wild vines right off the mountain. And in the dead of night, they rappel down the sheer cliff face on the far side of the mountain, the side Glaber left completely unguarded because he assumed it was physically impassable.
And they don't just use that to sneak away and hide, do they?
Nope. They circle around the base of the mountain and ambush the Roman camp from behind while the Romans are sleeping.
That is incredible.
It is a total slaughter.
Mm-hmm.
And the psychological impact of this specific victory is really what changes everything. It completely shattered the illusion of Roman invincibility.
Like realizing the Death Star has a thermal exhaust port.
Exactly. It was like watching a local neighborhood completely dismantle a highly trained special forces unit. Suddenly, every oppressed person in Italy realizes the Romans can actually bleed.
So it creates a massive ripple effect.
Huge. Tens of thousands of agricultural slaves, from those massive latifundia, local herdsmen, and even the free rural poor who had been displaced by the wealthy elites, flocked to join Spartacus.
But this brings up a massive logistical problem for me. Winning a skirmish is one thing, but suddenly Spartacus goes from leading 70 guys to managing tens of thousands of traumatized, impoverished people.
It's a nightmare scenario logistically.
Right. How do you feed them? How do you arm them?
Yeah.
How do you turn a mob of refugees into an army capable of fighting Roman legions?
It is one of the greatest logistical miracles in ancient military history, frankly. Spartacus and his multi-ethnic co-commanders, like the Gallic gladiator Crixus, for example, had to organize a force of Gauls, Germans, Thracians, and Italians.
And they all speak different languages, probably.
Exactly. They survived by systematically raiding the very latifundia they had escaped from, basically turning Rome's own massive agricultural supply chains against it.
Oh, that's brilliant.
Yeah. They stripped iron from farming tools and melted them down into weapons. They took the local herdsmen who knew the terrain perfectly and utilized them as natural scouting cavalry.
And he had to enforce actual military discipline on people who, let's be honest, probably just wanted to loot and run.
That was the hardest part. Appian records that Spartacus explicitly forbade his followers from hoarding gold and silver. He made them discard it entirely.
Really? No gold or silver?
None. He understood that if they became weighed down by heavy plunder, they would lose their mobility. He demanded they focus entirely on iron, brash, and survival. He was building an army, not a pirate crew.
But you can't hold a coalition of tens of thousands of traumatized people together perfectly forever, right?
Right.
You have this massive army, but they don't actually agree on what they are fighting for.
Right, and this is the core tragedy of the rebellion. The sources strongly indicate a massive ideological split within the leadership.
Over what exactly?
Well, Spartacus's vision was essentially a mass exodus. He wanted to march north, fight their way over the Alps, and then have everyone disperse back to their respective homelands in Gaul or Thrace. He wanted to escape the Roman world entirely.
But a huge faction, led by Crixus, wants something entirely different.
Yeah.
Because many of them were enslaved locally in Italy, right?
Yeah.
They didn't have a distant homeland to return to. They wanted revenge.
Yeah.
They wanted to stay and pillage the various states that had tortured them.
Exactly. So the army splinters. Crixus takes a massive faction away from the main group, and without Spartacus's tactical discipline, it ends exactly how you'd fear. Crixus and his followers are cornered by a Roman consul and utterly slaughtered.
That's devastating. But Spartacus's reaction to hearing about Crixus's death is one of the most chilling, symbolically loaded moments in the entire historical record, I think.
Oh, it's incredibly powerful.
It is pure, dark poetry. To mourn his fallen commander, Spartacus holds traditional funeral games. But he forces his Roman prisoners of war to fight to the death as gladiators.
Right.
He takes the ultimate symbol of Roman oppression, the very trauma that had birthed this entire rebellion, and forces his captors to experience it firsthand.
He turned the Roman machine violently back on its creators, and after this, Spartacus continues his march north.
Which leads us to the most baffling mystery of this entire deep dive. Because Spartacus pushes north, he actually reaches the Salpine Gaul, which is the region of northern Italy, right at the foothills of the mountains.
He's right there?
He defeats the Roman governor there. The path is completely clear. The Alps are open. The door to freedom is wide open. And then he turns around.
Yeah.
He marches his entire army back south, straight into the burning building of Italy. Why on earth would you do that?
It is the great unanswered question of the Servile War. I mean, the ancient sources offer no clear explanation. Did the rank-and-file soldiers simply refuse to leave the wealth of Italy, forcing Spartacus's hand?
Maybe.
Did Spartacus become intoxicated by his own success, perhaps thinking he could march on Rome itself? Or was the sheer logistical nightmare of crossing the freezing Alps with tens of thousands of non-combatants, elderly people, and children just physically impossible as winter approached?
Right. They had families with them.
Exactly. We just don't know the mechanism of the decision. But strategically, that U-turn was fatal.
Because by turning back south, he proves to Rome that he isn't just trying to leave. He is an existential threat to their homeland.
And the Senate is in full-blown panic mode at this point. Spartacus has defeated praetors. He has defeated the sitting consuls, the actual co-presidents of the Republic. The standard military response has completely failed.
So they have to escalate.
Big time. The Senate throws out the rulebook and hands extraordinary, almost unchecked power to Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome. Crassus uses his own massive fortune to raise upwards of 6 legions.
But Crassus has a massive morale problem, doesn't he? Because the Roman soldiers at this point are terrified of Spartacus. They've seen him butcher their commanders.
Oh, they're petrified. Crassus understands he has to reprogram his army. He basically has to make his men fear him infinitely more than they fear the rebels.
Right.
So when one of his subordinate units disobeys orders and flees from a minor skirmish with Spartacus, Crassus does the unthinkable. He revives a brutal, archaic military punishment called decimation.
Oh, man. Explain how that works, because it's horrifying.
It really is. He takes the cowardly cohort, divides them into groups of 10, and forces them to draw lots. The man who draws the short straw is brutally beaten or stoned to death by the other 9 men in his group.
By his own friends.
Yes. 1 in 10 men executed by their own comrades. It was a shocking, horrific psychological reset for the Roman military. It established absolute, terrifying discipline.
And it works. The Roman troops stop running. Crassus systematically pushes Spartacus all the way down to the Bruttian Peninsula, which is the absolute geographical toe of the Italian boot.
He's pinned against the sea.
Right. Spartacus tries to negotiate with Cilician pirates to ferry his army across the strait to Sicily. He pays them in advance, but the pirates just take the money and sail away, leaving the rebel army totally stranded.
And Crassus sees his opportunity to end it without a massive pitched battle. He decides to literally wall the rebels in and just starve them. So he orders his legions to build a fortification across the entire peninsula.
Okay, we have to pause and just appreciate the engineering scale of this.
It is staggering. In the dead of winter, using hand tools, Crassus's legions dig a trench 15 feet wide and 15 feet deep. And behind that trench, they build a massive timber and earth wall. And this fortification stretches for 37 miles from sea to sea.
Wait, 37 miles, hand tools? That is just wild to think about. It is a geographical chokehold the size of a modern superhighway project, built solely to suffocate one single rebel army.
Yep.
But Spartacus still manages to break it. In 71 BC, during a massive, blinding snowstorm, the rebels fill a section of the 15-foot ditch with earth, branches, and the literal bodies of their dead, and they fight their way over Crassus's wall.
They break out, but honestly, the writing is on the wall. Because the Roman Senate has recalled Pompey the Great from Spain to help crush the rebellion once and for all.
All right, the heavy hitters are coming in.
And Crassus is terrified that Pompey will arrive at the last minute and steal all the glory. So this forces a final, decisive confrontation.
The final battle. And the sources say that right before the fighting starts, they bring Spartacus his horse. But he draws his sword and kills the horse right there in front of his entire army.
It was the ultimate signal of commitment to his followers. He loudly declared that if they won the day, he would have his pick of the finest Roman horses on the battlefield.
Right.
And if they lost, well, he wouldn't need a horse anyway.
He was destroying his only means of escape.
Exactly. He was telling his men, there is no retreat. We achieve victory or we die here.
He fights like a demon. He tries to cut his way straight through the Roman lines to reach Crassus and end the war single-handedly. He personally kills 2 centurions, but he is eventually surrounded and cut down.
The carnage was so absolute that his body was never even identified.
But Rome wasn't content with merely winning on the battlefield, were they? They needed to send a message that would echo through history.
Appian details the horrific aftermath. The Romans captured roughly 6,000 surviving rebels. They didn't sell them back into slavery. They crucified every single one of them along the Appian Way, which was the main superhighway stretching from Capua, where the revolt began, all the way to the gates of Rome.
Imagine walking down a major paved highway for 130 miles, and every few dozen feet, there is another person nailed to a cross. This wasn't a punishment. This was a 130-mile-long billboard of human agony, with bodies left to rot, designed to guarantee that no enslaved person would ever dare look at a Roman master with defiance again.
It was state terrorism as architecture, a deliberate monument to Rome's brutal reassertion of dominance.
Right.
Yet, the incredible irony is that Rome's desperate attempt to bury Spartacus's legacy achieved the exact opposite.
Let's talk about that fallout.
Yeah.
Because Spartacus loses the war, But he fundamentally breaks the Roman Republic in the process, doesn't he?
He absolutely does, because he exposed a fatal flaw in the Roman political system. The Senate was so terrified of this gladiator that they threw away their constitutional norms.
They gave up their rules out of fear.
Right. They gave unprecedented, unconstitutional military power to rich strongmen like Crassus, and they allowed Pompey to swoop in and claim credit for catching a few fleeing rebels. And Pompey's bragging infuriated Crassus. The two men realized that the Senate's votes didn't matter anymore. Raw military might was all that dictated power in Rome now.
And that petty, bitter rivalry between Pompey and Crassus, born directly out of the ashes of Spartacus's rebellion, creates the blueprint for the first triumvirate. They eventually ally with a young upstart named Julius Caesar, which permanently destroys the democratic checks and balances of the Republic and leads straight to the Roman Empire.
Exactly. But beyond the political destruction of Rome, Spartacus's cultural legacy is even more fascinating. Because his internal thoughts and diaries are completely absent from the historical record, he became a blank canvas.
A symbol.
Yeah. Later generations were able to project their own contemporary struggles onto his framework. He became a global shorthand for the oppressed fighting back. Karl Marx cited Spartacus as the ultimate historical representative of the ancient proletariat.
Really?
Yeah, and during the 1919 German Communist uprising, the revolutionaries literally named themselves the Spartacist League.
That makes total sense. It even bleeds into pop culture as an act of genuine resistance. Like, think about the famous 1960 Stanley Kubrick film, Spartacus.
Oh yeah, the movie itself was a huge deal.
The creation of that movie was a real-world rebellion. The star and producer, Kirk Douglas, insisted on officially crediting the screenwriter, Dalton Trumbo. Now, Trumbo had been blacklisted and financially ruined during the McCarthy era for his political beliefs. By defying the government and putting Trumbo's name on the screen, the movie Spartacus effectively broke the Hollywood blacklist.
And it gave us that iconic fictional scene, I Am Spartacus, where all the captured slaves stand up and claim his identity to protect him from the Romans. It perfectly captures why the legend endures. It is about collective identity shielding the individual from a punitive, overwhelming state.
Spartacus was a man who lived only a few brief years in freedom. But in that tiny window, he built a functioning army out of discarded people and struck deep existential terror into the greatest empire on earth.
It is crucial to remember that Spartacus isn't just a biography of one exceptional man. It is a story about the nameless masses. Tens of thousands of Gauls, Germans, Thracians, and Italians died on those fields and on those crosses. Their individual names, their specific hopes, the distinct cruelties that drove them to risk crucifixion rather than remain in chains, all of that is lost to history. But the legend of their collective defiance survives precisely because it was a flash of lightning against impossible odds. It proved once and for all that even the most deeply entrenched, heavily militarized systems of domination are vulnerable.
It really shifts how you look at the mechanics of power. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. We know that the terror of Spartacus forced the Roman Senate to rely on ruthless strongmen, creating the exact political environment that allowed Julius Caesar to eventually seize dictatorial control. So think about this. By terrifying Rome into abandoning its own democratic norms to survive a slave uprising, did a Thracian gladiator inadvertently set off the chain reaction that ultimately destroyed the Roman Republic forever.